The dust is settling over one of the most watched political events in recent years. The U.S. presidential campaign spanned more than 18 months and cost $6 billion. And on Tuesday, President Barack Obama defeated his challenger, Mitt Romney. The U.S. president's first term in office was racked by severe political divisions between his Democratic Party and the opposition Republicans. So how will he approach his second term? Addressing supporters after his victory in Chicago, this is what President Obama said.
Tonight, more than 200 years after a former colony won the right to determine its own destiny, the task of perfecting our union moves forward. It moves forward because of you. It moves forward because you reaffirmed the spirit that has triumphed over war and depression, the spirit that has lifted this country from the depths of despair to the great heights of hope, the belief that while each of us will pursue our own individual dreams, we are an American family and we rise or fall together as one nation and as one people.
There's plenty on President Obama's plate, especially when it comes to foreign policy. What can he do to facilitate a peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians? How does he handle the winds of change in the Middle East? And how does he improve bilateral ties with China, especially after the harsh rhetoric on the campaign trail? Well, earlier I spoke with former U.S. Ambassador to China, John Huntsman. He's also the former governor of the state of Utah and a one-time Republican presidential candidate. Ambassador, we just went through a very contentious election. President Barack Obama starting his second term. Obviously, one of the foreign policy challenges will be managing this delicate relationship with China. How does he go about it?
Well, he has a head start, and a head start in the U.S.-China relationship, that of building bridges, establishing friendships, relationships, and a dialogue are all very important. And let's not forget that it takes a little bit of time to get all of that going, to get a little head of steam in such a very important relationship. So the last 4 years, I would argue, we've come around to the realization that the U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship in the world. Now for the next 4 years, it's going to be, what do you do about it? And how do you reorganize the bureaucracies on both sides? Now that you have a re-elected president, and after the 18th Party Congress, you'll have a new group of leaders at the very top in Beijing. So now it's 4 years of what do we do about the reality that we're both on the world stage, the United States and China. Both presidents have said repeatedly over the last 4 years that the 中美关系就是这个世界上最重要的关系, that the U.S.-China relationship is the world's most important relationship. So now it's going to be a very careful calculation about how you make sense out of that reality, how you bring people together, how you prioritize the issues that really matter on the economic side, on the security side, on the people-to-people side, and then how do you begin building trust over the next 4 years? That's really what it's going to come down to.
So if the president were to pick up the phone and say, Ambassador, you were over there, you helped us, I got to ask you, how do I build the trust? How do I move us forward? What would the suggestions be?
I would say that it takes a priority on the part of the President of the United States. This is a relationship that increasingly will be driven by the heads of state. So it's a head of state to head of state kind of relationship. It can't be subordinates in the bureaucracy. It's too important. And moreover, you've got to give commands from the very top to make this relationship work. And so it will be about making it a priority, giving it the time necessary, not on the margins of the UN General Assembly or APEC or the G20, but a regularized, focused, bilateral relationship where every year there are 2 or 3 dedicated meetings where it isn't a relationship driven by bureaucracy, but a relationship driven by the very top on both sides that promotes trust and better understanding and therefore realistic priorities around which we can begin to build our future.
You You were involved initially in this campaign, and then of course you've been on the sidelines watching it. There's been a lot of incendiary comments about China throughout. It seems like a lightning rod every 4 years. Let's beat up on China. It kind of can move the domestic audience. But what does it do in terms of that foreign policy exchange?
Well, first of all, in terms of domestic politics here, it's an easy applause line, but it's a mistake. It's always easier in domestic politics, and let's face it, you know, as my friends in China tell me, 中国也有政治. China has politics too. And so we have a political season in China just as you have a political season here. And therefore, during that political season, it's always easier to say what you're going to do to China as opposed to what you're going to do with China. The kind of conversation that we need on both sides is what we're going to do about the relationship, not to the relationship, but about the relationship. What is America going to do with China as opposed to China? So that kind of talk and incendiary rhetoric during a campaign is a waste of time after the election is over. And I say that because it then takes longer to get both sides together, to build the trust that is needed, and to then make sense out of what was soundbite policy. And a whole year is wasted in a relationship that goes in very distinct cycles where a year can be very costly. So hitting the ground running is increasingly important in this relationship, which means during an election cycle, beginning to talk about what we're going to do together to build a durable, realistic relationship based upon our shared interests as opposed to interests that converge or diverge. We all know where we differ. We need to know where we come together. And we just haven't had that conversation.
You know, you talk about China in a thoughtful way, and yet during campaigns, even during the foreign policy debate, and this is such a huge issue, it seemed like the relationship is kind of glossed over. It's talked about in sound bites, as you pointed out. Was that a missed opportunity for both of the candidates?
Of course, a huge missed opportunity. But let's recognize reality here. In the primary phase of a campaign, you get the early organizers and activists who turn out who want to hear a different kind of conversation. And then as you get more toward the final end of a campaign, more toward November, where in America we have our elections, that's when you get a lot of the mainstream people who begin to tune in, and they want to hear reality. They want to hear what the future truly holds as opposed to just red meat rhetoric and sound bites. So I would argue that if we begin these discussions at an earlier time, talking about reality, talking about a broad-based vision that is based on what the next generation is going to have to deal with respect to the U.S.-China relationship, we're better served. But there aren't a whole lot of people running for office these days who understand the U.S.-China relationship well enough to be able to put it in proper perspective in ways where they can actually present options or a realistic vision to the American people. And that's one of the challenges we face.
There's a recent piece in Foreign Affairs magazine. It's titled How China Sees America. And I think all too often it's how we see China. And you're talking about reality, but there is this argument between perception and reality, and the perceptions on both sides are probably inaccurate. How does China see us? How do we see them? And what's the reality? Because you've been there.
Well, China sees the United States as a power that might be waning somewhat, that in its fear of a changing world is trying to hem them in, engaged in regional diplomacy that would be built on holding China down, where that isn't the reality at all. The United States wants a strong and prosperous China. Why? Because we benefit and the whole world benefits from that. You have a stable region and a more prosperous region. We see China as a country that is stealing our jobs and therefore our economic future based upon unfair trade practices. So the reality is China has not lived up to all of its commitments under the WTO. I know, I've watched it very closely for years, but the fact of the matter is China has made some significant progress over the last generation. The first time I went to China with President Ronald Reagan in the early 80s, but I'd lived in Taiwan in the late 70s, so I'd seen China from the region. We didn't have any trade. We didn't have any economic interaction. There was nothing. Today, we're on the cusp of being the largest economic relationship the world has ever known. So something is working.
Let me talk to you about the other foreign policy issues that are on the president's plate. Syria, obviously, Iran. Where do you place them, and how does he approach those?
We need to clean up the Middle East. We need to fix it. It's broken. And we've spent over a decade engaged in conflict. And to my mind, we need more diplomacy and less militancy. We need to use our levers of power as a nation that speak to providing opportunity where there are pockets of despair. So why are people turning to radicalism and anti-Americanism? Because there aren't enough jobs and opportunity in parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. We're very easy to blame as a country. So what do you do about it? You have to provide security first and foremost. Some countries are in flux, and they will be for a very long time, and I'm not sure there's much that we can do about that over the short term. And I think this is a once per century kind of transition. Call it whatever you want. The Arab Spring, the Jasmine Spring. It's a once per century transformation that is based on long-standing dictatorships, economic disparities, and lack of job opportunities in many places. And three, the ability to communicate instantaneously in real time about your gripes and grievances toward your government. And all three of these things have never existed simultaneously before. We need to support through our strong principles, articulating democracy and liberty and human rights and free markets, and providing support for those who believe in those ideals. But in terms of boots on the ground, we've had enough in the way of boots on the ground. We can provide assistance, and we can provide other types of support other than boots on the ground. But more importantly, we need to step in with longer-term solutions other than just the military. That's how we're going to win longer term.
That was the former U.S. Ambassador to China, John Huntsman, talking to me earlier.